Ensuring freedom of the seas for commerce, travel, and basic human rights is a fundamental mission of the United States Navy, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard. Across vast distances, amidst great danger, more than 40,000 sailors deployed aboard nearly 300 ships are on the watch 24/7 to defend and protect our homeland. Today, this mission is familiar, our nation's strength a given. But its genesis took place 200 years ago in a very different world. The year is 1812. A small young nation only recently independent once again goes to war with the mother country, one of the most powerful empires on earth. Freedom of the seas is the core cause of the conflict. For years, the rights of American ships and sailors have been trampled by Great Britain as it seeks advantage in its global struggle with France. The war will be bitter, unpopular, and polarizing on both sides of the Atlantic. It will also provide a stunning surprise. Through 3 years of battle, a tiny, unheralded United States Navy stands up to the mighty British fleet, stunning the world in a series of ship-to-ship engagements decided by superior American technology, innovation, and determination. These are moments etched in American history. The USS Constitution, Old Ironsides, in all its glory. The Battle of Lake Erie, as a determined American flotilla sails forth to secure a pivotal victory. And one night near Baltimore Harbor, where a solitary figure sees his nation's flag still flying over embattled Fort McHenry, and in the dawn's early light puts pen to paper to write the Star-Spangled Banner. The War of 1812 gave us much more than a national anthem. It unleashed an American Navy, a Navy that to this day has proved essential to our nation's survival and prosperity, protecting international commerce, enforcing trade laws, and ensuring freedom of the seas. It is a global mission with global consequences. More than 90% of all international trade travels by sea, and 95% of all telecommunications travel under the sea. Our Navy's ability to operate forward is what protects these sea lanes and keeps the most serious threats far away from our shores. What began in 1812 has matured into today's Navy, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard, with a quick response capability second to none. Be ready, be rapid, be there. For warfighting and for humanitarian assistance in response to natural or man-made disasters. Freedom at sea in 1812. Freedom at sea today. The United States Navy, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard, keeping the sea free for more than 200 years.
It was a time of wooden ships and sailcloths, a time of muskets and longswords. It was when the young nation of America found itself in a second war with Britain and the American Navy came of age.
America's legacy as a blue water force for good can be traced to the 6 frigates of the fledgling Navy and the ship drivers who took them into harm's way. But the story of those frigates began years earlier.
Without a decisive naval force, we can do nothing definitive, and with it, everything honorable and glorious.
In the late 1700s, as Europe began to be embroiled in what would become the Napoleonic Wars, more than a dozen American merchant ships had been seized by the Barbary states of the Mediterranean, primarily those of Algiers. Sailors and ship owners were distressed. The ship owners besieged the nation's leaders for some sort of protection. The House of Representatives answered with a resolution claiming that a naval force adequate to the protection of the commerce of the United States against the Algerine corsairs ought to be provided. Congress formed a committee who later recommended that a small squadron should be formed in response. The proposal came to a vote in the House of Representatives on March 10, 1794, and passed with a 50-39 vote. President Washington signed the bill into law on March 27. The nation's War Office was now empowered to purchase or build 6 frigates. These frigates would be designed to carry between 32 and 44 guns, depending on their rating. One of the 39 votes that attempted to block the motion was from a Virginian named James Madison, who would be President of the United States 16 years later during a conflict that would be affected by the very frigates he opposed. The job of acquiring the frigates was now on the shoulders of Secretary of War Henry Knox, a veteran of the American Revolution. Knox would turn to a shipbuilder named Joshua Humphreys, a man who had already started design on a new class of frigate. The new frigates would play a major role in conflicts to come, and demonstrate a strength in designing ships to be as versatile as possible.
The innovative and cost-effective designs of today's Navy can be traced to the work of Joshua Humphreys.
Congress had approved the measure to buy or build 6 frigates, and Secretary of War Henry Knox settled upon a Philadelphia shipbuilder named Joshua Humphreys to design the ships. It was agreed upon by both men that the nation required a specific type of ship to defend its shores.
It is determined of importance to this country to take the lead in a class of ships not in use in Europe, which would be the only means of making our little navy of any importance.
Humphreys had studied everything he could about ship design and architecture. His designs would seek to combine the strength of the ships of the line with the speed and maneuverability of European frigates. The new frigates were to be 175 feet at the waterline, larger than the European frigates, carrying larger cannon while not sacrificing speed.
They are superior to any European frigate, and if others should be in the enemy's company, our frigates can always lead ahead and never be obliged to go into action, but on their own terms.
The goal of the design of Humphreys' frigates was to empower them in single ship-on-ship action, but also to give them the ability to outsail any heavily cannoned ship of the line. While the Congress of 1794 only cared about responding to Algerian corsairs, Humphreys intended his ships to be capable of engaging the European powers of the time if the need arose. President Washington approved the proposal for ships sent to him by Congress. He was also given a list of names to pick from for the ships. The first 5 frigates were the first 5 options on the list: United States, Constellation, Constitution, Congress, and President. The last was later named Chesapeake. In 1797, the first of the frigates, USS United States, was launched in Philadelphia. She would be followed by the Constellation and the Constitution a few months later.
Ships without leaders are just wooden or steel shells.
Nimitz, Halsey, Spruance, and Burke. These are the names of legendary fighting admirals that resonate with the fleet. But there were men who led our young Navy in the War of 1812 who also forged fighting reputations. Stephen Decatur, who began a prolific career with acts of daring during the conflict with the Barbary Corsairs. Isaac Hull, who shattered England's feeling of invulnerability when he led the crew of USS Constitution in the first capture of a British warship in the war. Oliver Hazard Perry, whose flag bore the words of a slain comrade as he engaged a British fleet on Lake Erie, defending the entire Ohio Valley. These men led an officer corps of exceptional warfighters and forged a tradition which has continued for 200 years, based on warfighting excellence and training that began during the War of 1812.
USS Constitution was launched in 1797 to protect American shipping. The ship was constructed of sturdy live oak, white oak, red cedar, and pitch pine. She is 207 feet from billet head to taffrail and 43.5 feet at her widest section. She was designed to carry 44 guns, but almost always carried more. In the War of 1812, Constitution was one of only a few U.S. Navy frigates, but was also of larger than average size, allowing her to carry more and heavier guns than her adversaries. In August 1812, Constitution met the British warship HMS Guerriere in the Atlantic. Captain Isaac Hull, in command of Constitution, brought his ship within 25 yards of Guerriere, blasting the enemy at point-blank range. The two ships locked together in a tangle of rigging as they traded cannon fire. When they separated, Constitution sailed ahead while Guerrière's weakened fore and mainmasts fell, leaving the ship dead in the water. Unable to continue the fight, the British surrendered. During the battle, Guerrière's shot failed to always penetrate Constitution's sturdy hull, earning her the enduring nickname Old Ironsides. Constitution would encounter other British warships during the war, and each time emerged victorious. Though her battles didn't have much effect on the outcome of the war, her victories against the Royal Navy were a source of inspiration to Americans. Constitution remained an active warship until the 1850s, when she began a new role as a training ship for midshipmen, a valuable service she filled for another 3 decades. Today, Old Ironsides remains the oldest commissioned warship afloat in the world and America's ship of state, and is berthed in Boston Harbor. The average annual visitation is 500,000 national and international visitors. The U.S. Navy is responsible for annual repairs and periodic restorations, with a mission to bring the ship back to her 1812 configuration as far as practicable. USS Constitution, a reminder of the proud and lasting legacy of the United States Navy. Early in the War of 1812, the United States planned to invade and conquer Canada. Western U.S. politicians wanted to remove the British influence from the frontier and obtain more land for settlement. The American militia outnumbered British troops, but the British relied on key bodies of water, Lakes Erie, Ontario, and Champlain, to quickly move men and resources. Naval battles fought on 2 of these lakes would affect the war's outcome. The Battle of Lake Erie, also known as the Battle of Put-in Bay, took place in September 1813. British control of Lake Erie had given them control of American territory, including Detroit. To break that control, the Americans built a fleet of small ships in the sheltered harbor at Erie, Pennsylvania, under the supervision of shipwright Noah Brown and Master Commandant Oliver Hazard Perry. Months earlier, Perry's friend, Captain James Lawrence, was mortally wounded in the devastating loss of USS Chesapeake. Perry was inspired by his friend's dying command, "Don't give up the ship," and had a flag made bearing those words, which he flew at the masthead of his flagship, the Lawrence, named for his fallen friend. As Perry's fleet rapidly took shape, British Commodore Barclay was quick to reinforce his own fleet, building HMS Detroit to defend the lake against the anticipated American attack. On September 10th, a day with light wind, Perry brought out his ships against his British counterpart. His flagship, Lawrence, engaged the center of the British line and was battered by the enemy's long guns. Taking down his flag from his badly damaged ship, Perry was rowed to the brig Niagara, where he resumed the fight. At that moment, the wind picked up, giving Niagara and the rest of the American ships a decisive advantage. When Barclay surrendered, the Americans regained control of the lake and their territory. The Battle of Lake Champlain in September 1814 found U.S. Master Commandant Thomas MacDonough's fleet in control of the waterway. The British planned to invade New York from Canada and seize American territory before negotiators could finalize a treaty to end the war. But a successful invasion would require them to take control of Lake Champlain from the Americans. Knowing an attack was coming and that he was outgunned, Macdonough anchored his ships in Plattsburgh Bay in such a way that the British ships would have to sail directly into his broadside. With light winds, the British flagship was unable to properly maneuver and also dropped anchor, trading close fire with Macdonough's flagship Saratoga. With both ships badly damaged, Macdonough's advanced planning gave him the advantage. He had anchored his vessels close together and was able to turn them using anchor cables only. In doing so, he shifted Saratoga around and resumed fire from her undamaged side. The British flagship Confiance was unable to match this maneuver and surrendered. The British invasion force was forced to retreat from American soil because the strategically important waterway remained in U.S. hands. From the beginning of the War of 1812, British ships controlled the waters of Chesapeake Bay. But because Britain was also fighting France, most of its troops were in Europe, so it couldn't mount an invasion. That changed in 1814, when Britain and her allies defeated Napoleon and imprisoned him on Elba, allowing Britain to shift both ships and men to the U.S. war. British troops in Canada planned to invade New York, but needed a diversion to the south. That diversion was to be an attack on the American capital, Washington, D.C. A massive British fleet assembled at Tangier Island in the Chesapeake. The bay was defended by the Chesapeake Flotilla, a collection of American barges and gunboats under command of Captain Joshua Barney. Though vastly outnumbered, these men were determined to mount a resistance. In August 1814, the British advanced up the Patuxent River, forcing Barney to retreat ahead of them. At Upper Marlboro, Maryland, British forces gathered and began their march on Washington by way of Bladensburg. Barney's sailors, with artillery from the Washington Arsenal, now Fort Leslie McNair, took up positions at Bladensburg along with units of the Army and militia. Though units around them fled in the face of the withering British assault, Barney's men fought bravely, and his guns took a heavy toll on the advancing British troops. The British eventually captured Barney, but immediately paroled him, a huge sign of respect for his valiant stand. Having overcome all resistance, the British next advanced on Washington, forcing President Madison and other government officials to leave the capital. The British planned to burn government buildings, but promised to spare private property as long as its owners were peaceful. Some of Barney's men occupied the Sewell Belmont House in the city, firing on the advancing British troops, killing the British commanding general's horse. The British torched the house as well as the White House, Capitol, and other government buildings. Dolly Madison, following instructions from the president, gathered up as many valuables as she could. Paul Jennings, President Madison's enslaved manservant, along with others, saved the Gilbert Stuart painting of George Washington, today considered a national treasure. Word of Barney's brave stand at Bladensburg quickly traveled to Baltimore, inspiring the defenders of that key port to hold out against the September British assault. As many as 900 U.S. naval officers and sailors, including over 200 from Barney's flotilla, deployed to defend the city, both aboard ship and on land. Citizens of Baltimore were also instrumental in setting up the city's defenses. Many of the city's defenders took up positions in Fort McHenry, where they traded artillery fire with the British warships, lighting up the night sky with the rocket's red glare. The Americans' determined resistance, inspired by Barney's men, proved to be inspiration for a civilian, attorney Francis Scott Key, who witnessed the bombardment aboard the deck of a British ship, where he had gone to conduct legal business. Moved by the sight of his country's flag at dawn fluttering over the fort, Key jotted down the words to a song that, in 1931, would become America's national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner. By December 1814, American and British negotiators in Ghent, Belgium, were in the final stages of treaty terms to end the War of 1812. But before the treaty was finalized, the British planned to make one last thrust from the Gulf of Mexico, capturing New Orleans and giving the British control of the Mississippi Valley. Time, however, proved to be Britain's enemy and America's ally. A huge British fleet under command of Sir Alexander Cochrane was headed for the Gulf, but first waited in the Caribbean for a smaller British squadron, which was delayed by its engagement with the American privateer General Armstrong in the Azores. Time lost, 3 days. When Cochrane's fleet and 8,000-man invasion force finally approached from the east of Lake Borgne, an American flotilla consisting of 5 gunboats under command of Lieutenant Thomas Ap Catesby Jones stood in his way. After a brief battle, Cochrane defeated Jones' force, navigated Lake Borgne, and landed invasion troops who made camp just 9 miles downriver from New Orleans. But in preparing for and fighting this battle, the British lost another 2 days. Major General Andrew Jackson, who at first thought the attack would come at Pensacola, Florida, had to rush his troops to New Orleans. When he heard that the enemy had advanced so close to the city, he ordered an attack on the British position. On the night of December 23rd, an American force of about 2,000 men approached the unsuspecting British troops at their camp near the Mississippi River. In the river, the schooner Carolina, under command of Commodore Daniel Patterson, opened fire, throwing the camp into chaos. Shortly thereafter, Jackson's men opened fire and engaged the British in a bloody encounter before they were pushed back to Rodriguez Canal outside the city of New Orleans next to Chalmette Plantation. The British suffered 275 casualties, the Americans 215. While the British waited for their entire force to arrive, Andrew Jackson's men dug in their position, creating earthworks along Rodriguez Canal. On January 8th, the British began their attack under darkness and a heavy fog. But as they approached Jackson's line, the fog lifted, exposing their ranks to heavy artillery fire. Meanwhile, a British regiment crossed the Mississippi to storm naval batteries manned by militia and turn the guns on Jackson's line. But again, a delay worked against the British. The regiment, running behind schedule, captured the American battery, but was ordered to withdraw because the main attack on the other side of the river had stalled. The exposed British soldiers took heavy casualties from the Americans and eventually retreated. Jackson's troops were a collection of men that ranged from free black and Native American troops to Kentucky militia to Navy gunners and U.S. Marines who bravely held their position. The failure to take New Orleans was a shocking defeat for the world's mightiest army. British losses from December 23rd to January 8th totaled 2,450 killed, wounded, missing, and captured. Similar American losses totaled 350 men. The victory in the Battle of New Orleans solidified the contributions of the sea services to national defense and made Andrew Jackson an American hero. With ratification of the Treaty of Ghent, the War of 1812 drew to a close. Who won? Or did anyone win? Neither the British nor the Americans gained or lost any territory, so perhaps no one won. But the United States was in many ways a changed country in the post-war years. The U.S. was destined to become a larger player on the international scene. The U.S. ended the war a more confident nation. America proved herself a capable foe for the world's greatest military power. Stephen Decatur, a naval officer who served with great distinction in the war, won more fame in the immediate post-war years for his victories in the Second Barbary War, which nearly propelled him to a presidential run in 1820. Andrew Jackson's stunning victory at New Orleans at the end of the war did in fact launch his political career, ultimately sending him to the White House in 1829. The country emerged from the War of 1812 with a growing navy. Following the war, Congress authorized a buildup of naval forces, the only time America ever added ships after a war. The ship of the line USS Columbus was part of this effort, launched in March 1819 at the Washington Navy Yard. Ohio and Pennsylvania also belonged to the group of 9 ships of the line. With this new emphasis on the Navy, the direction of the nation's defense was set. With 70% of the globe covered by water, with 80% of people living by the water, and with 90% of all trade traveling by water, the world's oceans are vital to commerce in an increasingly interconnected world. Our Navy was there in the past and will be there in the future, working to keep the sea lanes open. America's Navy, keeping the sea free for more than 200 years.